Ronald Ernest Ron Paul is an American politician, author, and physician, who is a former Republican congressman, two-time Republican presidential candidate, and the presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party in the 1988 U.S. presidential election. Paul served as the U.S. Representative for Texas' 14th and 22nd congressional districts. He represented the 22nd Congressional District from 1976 to 1977 and from 1979 to 1985, and then represented the 14th Congressional District, which included Galveston, from 1997 to 2013. On 3 occasions, he sought the presidency of the United States as the Libertarian Party nominee in 1988 and as a candidate in the Republican primaries of 2008 and 2012. Paul is a critic of the federal government's fiscal policies, especially the existence of the Federal Reserve, the tax policy, the military-industrial complex, and the war on drugs. Paul was the first chairman of the conservative PAC Citizens for a Sound Economy and has been characterized as the intellectual godfather of the Tea Party movement. A native of the Pittsburgh suburb of Green Tree, Pennsylvania, Paul is a graduate of Gettysburg College and the Duke University School of Medicine, where he earned his medical degree. He served as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force from 1963 to 1968. He worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist from the 1960s to the 1980s. He became the first representative in history to serve concurrently with a son or daughter in the Senate when his son, Rand Paul, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Kentucky in 2010. Paul is a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, and has been an active writer, publishing on the topics of political and economic theory, as well as publicizing the ideas of economists of the Austrian school such as Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises during his political campaigns. Paul has written many books on Austrian economics and classical liberal philosophy, beginning with The Case for Gold and including A Foreign Policy of Freedom, Pillars of Prosperity, The Revolution, A Manifesto, End the Fed and Liberty Defined. On July 12, 2011, Paul announced that he would forego seeking another term in Congress in order to focus on his presidential bid. On May 14, 2012, Paul announced that he would not be competing in any other presidential primaries but that he would still compete for delegates in states where the primary elections have already been held. At the 2012 Republican National Convention, Paul received 190 delegate votes. In January 2013, Paul retired from Congress but still remains active on college campuses, giving speeches promoting his libertarian vision. Early life, education, and medical career. Ronald Ernest Paul was born on August 20, 1935, in Pittsburgh, the son of Howard Caspar Paul, who ran a small dairy company, and Margaret Paul. His paternal grandfather emigrated from Germany, and his paternal grandmother, a devout Christian, was a first-generation German-American. As a junior at suburban Dormont High School, he was the 220-yard dash state champion. He graduated from Gettysburg College with a B.S. degree in biology in 1957. Paul earned a Doctor of Medicine degree from Duke University's School of Medicine in 1961, and completed his medical internship at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit and his residency in obstetrics and gynecology at Magee Women's Hospital in Pittsburgh. Paul served as a flight surgeon in the United States Air Force from 1963 to 1965 and then in the United States Air National Guard from 1965 to 1968. Paul and his wife then relocated to Texas, where he began a private practice in obstetrics and gynecology. Early congressional career. While a medical resident in the 1960s, Paul was influenced by Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which caused him to read other publications by Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand. He came to know economists Hans Sennholz and Murray Rothbard well, and credits to them his interest in the study of economics. when President Richard Nixon closed the gold window by ending American participation in the Bretton Woods system, thus ending the U.S. dollar's loose association with gold on August 15, 1971. Paul decided to enter politics and became a Republican candidate for the United States Congress. Elections in 1974, incumbent Robert R. Casey defeated him for the 22nd District. President Gerald Ford later appointed Casey to direct the Federal Maritime Commission, and Paul won an April 1976 special election to the vacant office after a runoff. Paul lost the next regular election to Democrat Robert Gamage by fewer than 300 votes, but defeated Gamage in a 1978 rematch, and was re-elected in 1980 and 1982. Gamage underestimated Paul's popularity among local mothers. "I had real difficulty down in Brazoria County, where he practiced, because it delivered half the babies in the county. There were only 2 obstetricians in the county, and the other one was his partner." Tenure. Paul served in Congress 3 different periods. First from 1976 to 1977, after he won a special election, then from 1979 to 1985, and finally from 1997 to 2013. In his early years, Paul served on the House Banking Committee, where he blamed the Federal Reserve for inflation and spoke against the banking mismanagement that resulted in the savings and loan crisis. Paul argued for a return to the gold standard maintained by the U.S. from 1873 to 1933, and with Senator Jesse Helms convinced the Congress to study the issue. He spoke against the reinstatement of registration for the military draft in 1980, in opposition to President Jimmy Carter and the majority of his fellow Republican members of Congress. During his first term, Paul founded the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education, a non-profit think tank dedicated to promoting principles of limited government and free market economics. In 1984, Paul became the first chairman of the Citizens for a Sound Economy, a conservative political group founded by David H. Koch and Charles G. Koch, to fight for less government, lower taxes, and less regulation. CSE founded the Tea Party movement in 2002, but it did not catch on. In 2004, Citizens for a Sound Economy split into 2 new organizations, with Citizens for a Sound Economy being renamed as Freedom Works, and Citizens for a Sound Economy Foundation becoming Americans for Prosperity. The 2 organizations would become key players in the Tea Party movement from 2009 onward. Paul proposed term limit legislation multiple times, while himself serving 4 terms in the House of Representatives. In 1984, he decided to retire from the House in order to run for the U.S. Senate, complaining in his House farewell address that special interests have replaced the concern that the founders had for general welfare. "It's difficult for one who loves true liberty and utterly detests the power of the state to come to Washington for a period of time and not leave a true cynic." Paul lost the Republican primary to Phil Gramm, who had switched parties the previous year from Democrat to Republican. Another candidate of the senatorial primary was Henry Grover, a conservative former state legislator who had lost the 1972 gubernatorial general election to the Democrat Dolph Briscoe, Jr. On Paul's departure from the House, his seat was assumed by former state representative Tom DeLay, who would later become House Majority Leader, Libertarian Party and Benches. 1985 to 1997. Following the loss of the 1984 Senate race, Paul returned to his obstetrics practice and took part in a number of other business ventures. Along with his former congressional chief of staff, Lew Rockwell, Paul founded a for-profit enterprise, Ron Paul and Associates, Inc. In 1984, with Paul serving as president, Rockwell as vice president, Paul's wife Carol as secretary, and daughter Lori Piat as treasurer. The company published a variety of political and investment-oriented newsletters, including Ron Paul Freedom Report and Ron Paul Survival Report. and by 1993 was generating revenues in excess of $900,000. Paul also co-owned a mail-order coin dealership, Ron Paul Coins, for 12 years with Bert Blumet, who continued to operate the dealership after Paul resumed office in 1996. Paul spoke multiple times at the American Numismatic Association's 1988 convention. He worked with his Foundation for Rational Economics and Education on such projects as establishing the National Endowment for Liberty, producing the At Issue public policy series that was broadcast on the Discovery Channel and CNBC, and continuing publication of newsletters. 1988 presidential campaign. Paul resigned from the Republican Party in 1987 and launched a bid for the presidency running on the Libertarian Party ticket. His candidacy was seen as problematic because of the party's long support for freedom of choice on abortions. Native American activist Russell Means emphasized that he was pro-choice on the abortion issue. In a forum held prior to the nomination, Means dismissed the greater funds raised by Paul's campaign, commenting that Means was receiving 10 times more press than the former congressman and was therefore 100 times more effective. In the 1988 presidential election, Paul was on the ballot in 46 states, scoring third in the popular vote with 432,179 votes. Paul was kept off the ballot in Missouri, due to what the St. Louis Post-Dispatch termed a technicality, and received votes there only when written in, just as he did in North Carolina. According to Paul, his presidential campaign was about more than obtaining office. He sought to promote his libertarian ideas, often to school and university groups regardless of vote eligibility. He said, "We're just as interested in the future generation as this election. These kids will vote eventually, and maybe, just maybe, they'll go home and talk to their parents." Paul considered campaigning for president during 1992, but instead chose to endorse Pat Buchanan that year, and served as an advisor to Buchanan's Republican presidential primary campaign against incumbent President George H. W. Bush. Later congressional career. Elections. 1996 campaign. During 1996, Paul was re-elected to Congress after a difficult campaign. The Republican National Committee endorsed incumbent Greg Laughlin in the primary. Paul won with assistance from baseball pitcher, constituent, and friend Nolan Ryan, tax activist and publisher Steve Forbes, and conservative commentator Pat Buchanan. Paul narrowly defeated Democratic attorney Charles Lefty Morris in the fall election. Despite Morris's criticism over controversial statements in several newsletters that Paul published, 1998 to 2013. In 1998 and 2000, Paul defeated Loy Sneary, a Democratic Bay City, Texas, rice farmer and former Matagorda County judge. In the 2008 Republican primary, he defeated Friendswood City Councilman Chris Pedden, with over 70% of the vote, and ran unopposed in the general election. In the 2010 Republican primary, Paul defeated 3 opponents with 80% of the vote. On July 12, 2011, Paul announced that he would not seek re-election to the House in order to pursue the 2012 presidential election. 10-year legislation of the 620 bills that Paul had sponsored through December 2011, over a period of more than 22 years in Congress. Only one had been signed into law, a lifetime success rate of less than 0.3%. By amending other legislation, he has helped prohibit funding for national identification numbers, funding for federal teacher certification, international criminal court jurisdiction over the U.S. military, American participation with any UN, global tax, and surveillance of peaceful First Amendment activities by citizens. Affiliations. Paul was honorary chairman of, and is a member of the Republican Liberty Caucus, a political action committee that describes its goal as electing liberty-minded, limited government individuals. He is an initiating member of the Congressional Rural Caucus, which deals with agricultural and rural issues, and the 140-member Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus. Committee assignments: Paul served on the following committee and subcommittees: Committee on Financial Services, Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology, Subcommittee on International Monetary Policy and Trade, Committee on Foreign Affairs, Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. With the election of the 112th Congress, and a resulting GOP majority in the House, Paul became the chairman of the Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology starting in January 2011. Paul's congressional career ended on January 3, 2013 with the swearing-in of the 113th Congress. 2008 Presidential Campaign. 2008 Republican Primary Campaign. Paul formally declared his candidacy for the 2008 Republican nomination on March 12, 2007, on C-SPAN. Few major politicians endorsed him, and his campaign was largely ignored by traditional media. However, he attracted an intensely loyal grassroots following, in large part energized by iconoclastic white men, interacting through internet social media. In May 2007, shortly after the first televised primary debates, the blog's search engine site Technorati.com listed Paul's name as the term most frequently searched for, and Paul's campaign claimed that Paul had more YouTube channel subscribers than Barack Obama or any other candidate for president. For a candidate who had had relatively low national name recognition prior to entering the race, Paul did surprisingly well in fundraising, taking in more money than any other Republican candidate in the fourth quarter of 2007, as the primary season headed into the Iowa caucuses. Despite benefiting from large numbers of campaign contributions from individual donors, and the efforts of tech-savvy supporters determined to keep his name a frequent topic of discussion on the internet, over the course of the campaign Paul was unable to translate the enthusiasm of his core supporters into large enough numbers of actual primary votes to unseat his rivals. Paul came in fifth place in both the January 4 Iowa caucuses and the January 8 New Hampshire primary, with the exception of the Nevada caucuses January 19, where he came in second behind Romney. He did little better through the rest of January. Michigan 4th, South Carolina 5th, Florida 5th. On Super Tuesday, February 5, he placed fourth in almost every state, generally taking in a mere 3 to 6% of the votes, although he did better in the northern states of North Dakota and Montana. By March, frontrunner John McCain had secured enough pledged delegates to guarantee that he would win the nomination, and Romney and Huckabee had both formally withdrawn from the race. Paul, who had won no state primaries, knew that it was now mathematically impossible for him to win the nomination, as he had captured only 20 to 40 pledged delegates compared to more than 1,191 for McCain. Yet he refused to concede the race and said that it was unlikely that he would ultimately endorse McCain. Over the next few weeks, Paul's supporters clashed with establishment Republicans at several county and state party conventions over state party rules, the party platforms, and selection of delegates for the national convention. In one of the more dramatic moments, Nevada's state party leaders, outmaneuvered by Paul's supporters at the state nominating convention, resorted to the highly unusual measure of prematurely and abruptly shutting down the convention before selecting national delegates, with a plan to reconvene at a later date. On June 12, 2008, Paul finally withdrew his bid for the Republican nomination. He later said that one of the reasons he did not run in the general election as a third-party candidate, after losing the primaries, was that, as a concession to gain ballot access in certain states, he had signed legally binding agreements to not run a third-party campaign if he lost the primary. Some of the $4 million remaining campaign contributions was invested into the new political action and advocacy group called Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty. refusal to endorse the Republican nominee at a September 10, 2008, press conference. Paul announced his general support of 4 third-party candidates: Cynthia McKinney, Bob Barr, Chuck Baldwin, and Ralph Nader. He said that each of them had pledged to adhere to a policy of balancing budgets, bringing the troops home, defending privacy and personal liberties, and investigating the Federal Reserve. Paul also said that under no circumstances would he be endorsing either of the 2 main parties' candidates because there were no real differences between them, and because neither of them, if elected, would seek to make the fundamental changes in governance that were necessary. He urged instead that, rather than contribute to the charade that the 2-party election system had become, the voters support the third-party candidates as a protest vote, to force change in the election process. Later that same day, Paul gave a televised interview with Nader saying much the same again. 2 weeks later, shocked and disappointed that Bob Barr had pulled out of attending the press conference at the last minute and had admonished Paul for remaining neutral and failing to say which specific candidate Paul would vote for in the general election. Paul released a statement saying that he had decided to endorse Chuck Baldwin, the Constitution Party candidate, for president. Paul withdrew from active campaigning in the last weeks of the primary election period. He received 42,426 votes, or 0.03% of the total cast, in the general election.